Hi, everybody.
Hello.
Happy Friday. Welcome to PAX. We're excited to have everybody here. We were just on the last panel, which I've been sitting in this chair for a long time. I'm really excited to see some faces back at this panel again. This panel is Release the Minions, Introducing RPGs to Youth. This panel is brought to you by Game to Grow, which is a nonprofit organization based in the Seattle area that was founded on the idea that games of all kinds have the power to improve people's lives, and even more so if played with intention, and even more so if facilitated by a professional. And everybody on this table right here is a professional who plays games with kids, specifically RPGs. So let's introduce ourselves to the audience.
Oh, should I start?
You should start, because I've been talking.
I'm Adam Johns. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist in Kirkland. I am one of the executive directors of Game to Grow. I have been working along with Adam Davis in using tabletop role-playing games like Dungeons & Dragons for therapeutic intervention for about 7 years now. Together, Game to Grow runs 5 weekly Dungeons & Dragons groups, serving up almost 40 kids a week. Using it for social skill development. So we see a lot of challenges related to autism, anxiety, ADHD within our groups, and helping kids and teens build friendships and build stronger relationships and stronger social skills to keep those relationships.
My name is Adam Davis, the other Adam from Game to Grow. My background is in drama therapy with a master's in education. And as Adam mentioned, we serve a lot of kids, and our youngest kids are around 9 years old, and our oldest are in their early 20s, and a lot of those kids come to us having never played Dungeons & Dragons or any kind of role-playing game before. So we have a lot of experience teaching brand new players the game.
And my name is Ethan Schoonover, and I am currently the technology director at a local Seattle middle school, Lake Washington Girls Middle School. And somehow, I'm the technology director there, but somehow I convinced them to let me run D&D as well. And so we did that for the first year. This past year, we had, it started off as a Friday night club. We moved on from there and established an actual elective class for Dungeons & Dragons during the day. Which was a big move, and then we ran a summer camp this summer for girls. We had 14 girls for summer camp, and this year I opened up the Friday night club again. Last year we had 6 girls in it, and right now I think we're at over 20, so it's growing quickly.
Yeah,
That's
really
fantastic.
taken off.
Yeah.
That's spectacular.
So I'm curious about the people in the audience. Raise your hand if you are someone who currently plays role-playing games with kids. Some of you. Awesome. Fantastic. Raise your hand if you're someone who wants to play role-playing games with kids. You have kids, maybe you're a teacher, a parent, and you really want to share the love of role-playing games with other people. Awesome. Well, I'm glad you're here. You chose the right panel to come to. So when we're talking about how to introduce role-playing games to kids, there's really 3 things that we want to talk about. The first one is choosing the game. How do you know what game is right for your kids? Also, once you choose that game, how do you introduce the games? And then finally, how do you modify the game if necessary to make sure it's a role-playing game that the family's going to really enjoy, or the kids themselves are really going to enjoy? Let's start off with choosing the game. And Ethan let us use the pictures from his students. So
right.
Thanks for letting us use that. So how do we choose a game?
It's like such a tough question.
Yeah, raise your hand if
question.
you love Dungeons and Dragons. If that's your game. So that's the game that Adam and I play in our groups. We play Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition with all of the kids that are in our groups, and that's part of the reason we chose that game is because we grew up playing Dungeons and Dragons. It's not necessarily the best game to play with kids. It's just the game that we're the most familiar with.
Yeah, and when I was picking a game, I decided, okay, I'm going to play role-playing games with the girls at Lake Washington Girls Middle School. I actually did not choose D&D at first, and I started playing D&D back in the late 70s, early 80s, and of course I played, the D&D Basic and first edition AD&D, and I didn't really play anything else until my friend Trevor, who's sitting over here, dragged me back into role-playing games. Damn you, Trevor. And we played DCC, and I actually thought I might play something like that, something that was very old school, because that's sort of my background, and I like that simplicity. So
DCC is Dungeon Crawl Classics.
Dungeon Crawl Classics. That's right. It's a very old school. Lots of characters die, and it's a little horrific.
Yeah, and maybe DCC wasn't the right game for the kids you were playing with?
Yeah, and I think that there are two considerations. One is for me, and I want you both to talk about this separately because I think your considerations might be a little different, but I was concerned about two types of accessibility. So there's the accessibility of the game itself, right? And I mean, speaking really frankly, I don't think D&D is a super accessible game in some ways because the rules can be a little complicated. Even for me as a dungeon master, and I've played for decades now, it's sometimes a chore to get through, and that can feel a little overwhelming for new players. So it was not necessarily the most accessible game, but by introducing D&D to my students, one of my primary goals is to give them the game, to let them own the game, and to let them be part and have a sense of ownership of being in role-playing games. And D&D is a lingua franca. So I wanted to make sure that they had that accessibility and accessibility to the gaming culture and gaming community that they wouldn't necessarily have if we had chosen a more niche product.
Yeah, Dungeons & Dragons is sort of like the Kleenex of role-playing games or the Xerox machine of role-playing games. So it's really easy for people to sort of understand what that means when you sit down to play D&D.
Yeah, we talk with a lot of parents who go, hey, we're introducing what we do and how this is a therapeutic intervention, and a lot of times they don't really know what D&D is or they don't know what role-playing games are, but even if we just say D&D, everybody's pretty much heard of it in some way. Maybe they heard of it because of the Satanic Panic back in the 80s, or maybe they heard of it because they remember the Dungeons and Dragons movie that came out a while ago, the 90s?
Or the cartoon.
Or the cartoon. But either way, they have some connection to it, and that's a good starting point. But I agree that there's a value that sort of stretches beyond that, which is about building the community and being able to introduce yourself as to being a part of this bigger thing, and being a part of Dungeons and Dragons, I think is a piece to that.
Yeah.
If you're teaching somebody how to get into the game, being able to teach Dungeons and Dragons is maybe a little bit more effort, but it also is a little bit more. Now you're a part of this bigger thing that you can dive into with other people.
And
yeah. So go ahead.
If there's a game that you love, there's no reason why you couldn't modify that to be the game that you play with your kids. That's sort of the most important currency here, is that enthusiasm that you bring to the table. So if you love D&D, then play D&D. I think that's the most important thing that you can do as the person who's trying to introduce more people is share the love. That's the thing that's the most important.
And of course, age is a huge factor here. So we can kind of scale this back for a moment and talk a little bit about what impact age might have. If you're looking at a younger audience, and I think we'll talk about some of the games that are out there and available for this. It's not necessarily D&D. It's not necessarily any specific role-playing game, and maybe I'll mention some of the games that I introduce my own kids to later on. But I just want to come back to what your goals are when you're introducing a game to youth. If your goals are just to have fun, and for me, that's tier one, right? Just to love gaming. Any game is going to work. As long as it's appropriate for the age, any game is going to work. A made-up game is going to work. If your goal is to love the game and then to learn the game and really have them learn the rules and teach them the basics of playing a specific game, then you're thinking about what community are they becoming part of by learning that game. And again, for me, I think it's really important, especially for the girls I work with, middle school girls. I want them to feel like they can walk into a gaming store and own that kind of majority product, right? That they go in and they say, D&D, yeah, that's mine. I got that. And they don't have to look for like some obscure book on some shelf, right?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, that being said, there are some great games that are out there that have been made for role-playing with kids. There's a game that we actually played with our youngest group called No Thank You Evil, which is made by Monty Cook Games, designed by Shanna Germain, who we actually invited to be on this panel, but she had to be elsewhere, so she says hi. And it's a fantastic introduction to role-playing games for younger kids. It's accessible to kids as young as 6. I've seen people on the internet playing it as young as 4. It's really very tactile. There's little pieces you can use. There's only 1d6 that you have to roll, and it's like a beat a number system. There's not really a lot of math, so it makes it really accessible to kids who that's really what you want to do, is make a story, roll a die, and see what happens. I'll
also toss out there that Pugmire is a great game with a sort of stripped down system that's really designed for. It's a game all about dogs in a world after after the apocalypse happens or something.
The story is that cats and dogs all awakened after mankind has sort of disappeared off the face of the earth, and so people are playing these awakened dogs that have discovered all the remnants of mankind and have to make sense for why the best friend has left the earth.
Which is a hilarious idea for a setting, but it also
that sounds hilarious.
Right, it's
yeah,
super
not
fun.
sad at all.
It's not sad. It's hilarious. Dogs, like playing poker. It's basically like a role-playing game based off of that dogs playing poker painting. So the part of the reason Pugmire is really great, though, is that it's basically 5th edition, but with a lot more simplified rules and a setting that lets you play as animals, which, especially for a younger audience, is a huge appeal. I got a chance to play No Thank You Evil with a group of siblings in private practice working through a family divorce, and the youngest player, who was 4 years old, was wanted to play a cat, and they were just a cat. And No Thank You Evil is great because it leaves everything open. You can play just about anything you want in No Thank You Evil, and the mechanics work for all of that. And so that player played a cat along with their older siblings, who also played cats, but cat people who could shapeshift back and forth between being cats and people, because they wanted the versatility. And so it was just a group of cats basically walking around in a fantasy world doing cat stuff. But Pugmire also has a lot of that great accessibility because you get to be dogs and cats in this crazy fantasy world afterwards.
Maybe I should talk a little bit about how I introduce my kids.
I think that would be really helpful.
Yeah.
How old are your kids?
So my children are now 9 and 11, and I've tried to stop that progression, but they keep getting older. And when
no matter what you do. Really.
Yeah, no matter what I do.
Yeah.
When they were pretty young, and I want to say starting when my youngest was around 4, we started, and I'm just going to assume this is true for anybody here that has kids or works with kids, but, I read to my kids every day. And I think that's probably the single best thing that you can do as a role-playing parent is to read stories with your kids. And the great thing about reading a story versus, say, an audiobook, what's the difference is you can stop and talk, and you can ask questions. And that's really how it started for me is, just, again, and I'm approaching this both from a parent perspective and from a role-playing perspective, I would stop when I was reading a story with my kids and I would ask them questions like, what would you do? What do you think will happen? Is this character good or bad? Just little things in the middle of the story, but then we'd keep reading. Later on, what we would do is we would play what we called story game. And this is the role-playing game that we all play. You all play a story game. You just don't know it. No matter what role-playing game you're playing, you're probably playing story game. And story game is just role-playing games without any rules, right? So you're not necessarily rolling any dice, and the story game usually starts off something like this. You're walking through a forest, and your names are, and then they come up with some names. And maybe their names are their names, and maybe their names are their names backwards. But they're walking through a forest, and they see a pile of leaves. And then they see a squirrel, but this squirrel is wearing a hat, and it runs by into the pile of leaves. What do you do? And that's it. I mean, that's how you turn your children into role players. That was an awesome game, by the way. And then we did another one, which was Shadow World, where everything is backwards and upside down and inverted, and horses talk with people that ride on their backs and eat grass and all sorts of stuff. And it's just made up. And then what you do is you take a D6 or a D20 and you start to have them roll for stuff. And again, rollover works great. And so really No Thank You Evil is probably a much better thought out version of this. I did back that Kickstarter. I haven't seen it yet, so I can't speak to it.
It's still like the core of it. I think the story game is really at the core of that. How young were they when you started doing this?
Yeah, so easily my youngest was 4. Yeah. Right. And so for me that natural progression is you're moving from narrative, you're moving from story, and you're moving from story that you're experiencing together, face to face, which is sort of the core of tabletop gaming, and you're moving it then into an interactive mode. And this is actually not that different in some ways from the way that I feel like I introduce the D&D to my students now. So, should we move into introducing the game, do you think? Or?
Let's move on to the second slide. Introducing the game. How do you introduce that game? So it sounds like, Ethan, what you do to begin with is you have people get used to making up stories and playing. When I first learned how to play D&D, I didn't learn how to play D&D. I learned how to make up stories on a school bus, and we called it D&D. Because we didn't have dice. We couldn't roll dice on the school bus. So we were just like, what do you want to do? Well, I want to go kill that thing. Great. You swing your sword, you win. That was the whole game.
And this is when you were a kid?
That was when I was a kid.
And did you have the rules?
No. We just made up. It was a story game. We just called it D&D.
Did you hear that you leveled up after you swung the sword?
Totally.
Yeah.
We leveled up so many times. That was the whole game. I was the game master, and I just talked to people on the bus and said, what do you guys want to do? Let's kill stuff. Okay. 5th grade.
I think there's something to like sort of teaching that format. I don't think it's it's sort of a natural thing that we do when we're young kids and we're playing and we're just collaboratively telling stories together. Yeah. But there's something about the game master format that is just slightly different from that, where one person is sort of clearly in charge of the next things that happen in the story. That is not maybe a natural thing that we do as kids with play. That you sort of have to introduce that concept in the story game format, essentially.
Yeah. So introducing dice mechanics.
Introducing dice. I want to talk a little bit about how I introduced the game to the girls.
Yeah. Let's do it.
Yeah. Dive into that.
Okay. So I'll circle back to dice specifically. So Friday night rolls around. This is at Lake Washington Girls Middle School. So I want you to picture an aging brick building. In the summertime, this turns into a brick oven. In the fall, it's pleasantly warm. And this is a typical red brick building here in Seattle, the kind you don't want to be in if there's an earthquake. And we, the days are getting shorter, so it's a little dark inside the room. The curtains are drawn. The girls are adamant. We do not turn on the lights. D&D is played in the dark. How do you know that? We just know it.
With no prior knowledge or experience.
I think it primarily comes from Stranger Things.
Yeah.
If we do have a basement, we played in the basement later on. And so we're in this room. And I have sweated and I am a bundle of nervous energy. Much like I am now, as you can tell. And we sit down, and I have spent weeks thinking about what do I need to have happen on this first session? This is it, right? Because if they have a bad experience, they're going to walk away and they're going to think, yeah, D&D is not like Stranger Things. It's not as cool as I thought it was. It's not fun, or it's not for me. It's only a boys' game, which, by the way, some of the girls specifically thought and said. It's my dad's nerdy game, another quote from one of the girls. And what I wanted them to come away with was, oh my God, I want to play again. I want to play a second game. What's going to happen? So we only have an hour and a half. And how do you do that in an hour and a half? So introducing the game, the first thing was, let's talk about the types of characters you can be. And I don't want to talk about fighters. I don't want to talk about magic users. I don't want to talk about thieves because we don't have time. We can talk about, do you want to be a dwarf? Do you want to be a human being? Let's talk about these crazy things you can be. So I had them pick a race. I had them pick a name. And I had them roll a d30. I pretended to look up a background on a table. You are an assistant butcher. You have a cleaver. You are a stable hand. You have a pitchfork. And you can see where that's going. They have some basic stuff, and they have a job, and they live in a village, and then trouble comes to town, and immediately there's peril, and they have to flee the village. They have to pack up stuff. And the time it took me to describe that was how long it took us to start playing. And I think that is really important. You must, with kids, I really feel it's important to just immediately create tension. And I'm thinking back to a book called Hamlet's Hit Points, which I think everybody should read. Immediately kind of create this up and down beat cycle where you get them hooked right away. And then you can start to introduce other aspects of the game. And I'm going to turn this over to you guys for a little bit because I've talked long enough.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the most important things that you can do as you're introducing the game is like you said, you should be playing as fast as possible. Especially seasoned and veteran role-playing game players have a tendency to want to really dig into character creation. And I love character creation. I love making new characters. I love conceptualizing new characters. But I also recognize that when you are a new player, you don't have any basis for any of that. You don't have any basis for being excited about any of it because you don't know what it looks like on the other end of that character, and you can't put yourself into that place. So in Game to Grow groups, we do pre-made characters, and we just have a character sheet, and we just ask a series of very basic questions to say, when you imagine your character in a fantasy world like Lord of the Rings, do you think about, is your character fighting up close against other people, or are they fighting far away, like with a bow and arrow or with magic spells? And we just ask a couple of questions like that to narrow down, and then be like, great, you're a barbarian. Done. This is your character, and then we hand over the character sheet and we say, ignore everything on there. Don't pay attention to any of that. All we're going to do is we're going to make a character name. And then we slowly introduce all the pieces throughout the course of the game itself. So that the first day, after they've made a name and they've maybe come up with a small amount of backstory, we actually have a few questions that we like to ask in creating small backstories for characters. But now they can jump right in, and they're playing the game, they're right off the bat. And I agree, tension. There should be like an immediate tension, maybe something fun to go along with. One of our favorite introductions into the campaign is with Seamus. And the way the Seamus story works is this. All the players come into a tavern. This is a classic tavern opening. It's okay to give tropes for somebody who's never played before.
And in our games, when they go to the tavern, it's actually a soup tavern.
Oh yeah, we don't have alcohol in our games.
So they just drink mugs of frothy golden soup.
Yeah. So they come into...
Served in steins.
Served in steins, yeah, of course. They're just delicious soup. They come into the soup tavern. It's called the best soup tavern in town. It's in a small town. It's the only soup tavern in the town, but that's the title of the tavern. And as they come in, they get to meet Seamus. And Seamus is warm and welcoming. Adam and I both have different voices for Seamus, but I do sort of a piratey voice where Seamus is really happy to see you.
Mine's kind of like this. Hey guys, welcome to town. You guys want some soup?
Voices are really important, help create tons of engagement and involvement in the thing, and it helps set the tone that this is a fun experience that we're having, and a goofy experience that we're having. And then Seamus will go around and ask everybody what kind of soup they want, and Seamus really is the best soup kitchen in town. Seamus has every soup. We have players that come in and they go, I want nothing. He goes, nothing soup. I've got some great nothing soup for you. It's very light. It's very airy. And Seamus will leave into the back room and he will bring you back a soup, whatever soup you have requested. We've had players request everything from potato soup, just straight up, to nothing soup, to dragon fire soup, to all sorts of things. And Seamus will always have a soup for you. He will always bring it back, and Seamus will always be friendly and engaging with you. And then shortly after all the players come in and they do the soup tavern, all of a sudden skeletons burst from the floor and from the walls and start attacking all the people in the soup tavern. And then a man in black armor bursts through the wall and he holds up a shadowy dagger that floats from his hand and stabs Seamus in the stomach.
First the dogs, and now Seamus.
That right there, Ethan, is exactly why we do that. Because there's an Seamus.
So we want to create a play space. We want to create a fun environment, and then we want to up the tension.
No, it's.
And depending on the age of our players, Seamus doesn't always die. Sometimes Seamus dies if we have old enough players to handle that, and sometimes Seamus is now the players have to go on a quest to heal him because the dagger was like the dagger that Frodo gets stabbed in Lord of the Rings, has some type of curse on it, and now the players have to go to the healer and have to go get the materials in order to heal Seamus and remove the curse that he has on him. And now it's created needed something that pulls everybody together and that gets everybody involved in the storyline. And almost none of those things actually had anything to do with the character class they picked or any particular aspect of it. It's just getting them involved into the storyline themselves and gave them little chances to kind of answer questions or describe things about their character as Seamus was having interactions with.
It also gets them really quickly into an adventure. Like you then have a mission. You have something that the group is aligned on. I think one of the pitfalls a lot of new game masters get into, especially new game masters for kids, is they say, you come into town, what do you want to do?
Oh, yeah. Don't do that.
And they're like, well, it's literally a sandbox. I can do whatever I want to do. I want to burn down the library. Well, I have no reason not to. So let's burn some stuff down. So it's really useful to give them a mission where they can, help somebody do something positive. But this opportunity to meet Seamus also really introduces the idea that you're in a play space. This is like the playground. I'm playing with you, even though I'm the adult and you're the kid. We're in a sort of a collaborative space where we're building something together. And then in the Seamus story, oftentimes it turns out the reason why the man in dark armor wanted to kill Seamus is because underneath this humble soup kitchen is actually the back entrance to a long forgotten dungeon that has a magic item in it. And this guy is trying to track down this ancient chalice or whatever it might be. And the players have to go beat that man in the black armor to that item. So now there's an easy opportunity for none of that sandboxing stuff. Now they have a specific goal they're oriented towards. And a lot of our players, specifically in our groups, don't know each other before the group starts. So they're needing an extra bit of gumption to get them on the same team. So a lot of good hooks at the beginning of an adventure might be something that gets the team aligned. Our kids love Seamus. So then when Seamus is killed, they want to get revenge on the guy in dark armor so bad that any of that tension that happened before, somebody was wearing a Batman t-shirt and they had an argument in the waiting room about which Batman was the best Batman, none of that matters anymore because they must get the guy in the black armor. So oftentimes underneath the soup kitchen is this dungeon, which we then sort of use as a tutorial dungeon. And it's a fantastic way. Think about a video game that you're playing and how you learn how to play the game effectively. They tend to give you things little by little. They don't let you do whatever you want to do. They sort of give you an opportunity where they say, press A here. So we sort of do the same thing, where in the basement there is a secret door. And then we don't know where the secret door is, but now let me teach you how searching works, investigation might work. And then they find that secret door, and then they go into a room where there are giant spiders. Now let's teach you how combat works. Now there's another sort of logical puzzle. Now there's this kind of thing. And so once they make it through those series of dungeons, they've basically gone through the tutorial of Dungeons & Dragons.
Ethan, you did a pretty brilliant thing that you were telling us about where you were using character races. You use like an engagement, a totally different kind of engagement to help the players engage with different character races.
Yeah, so this was actually at summer camp, and we did things a little bit differently at summer camp. So when we ran summer camp this summer, we had them actually fill out their character sheet for the first day. And it is a testament to the complexity of 5e that it took us a day. To like work through all the different aspects. But one of the things that we did is I ran the camp with two other women, Hidil Almasari and Kat Kruger, and they both are heavily involved in D&D, and they stream and they do podcasts. And Kat had the idea to have them do a kind of a paired presentation. So this is a common strategy in classroom management where you have kids pair up and do a presentation about, the rail barons, whatever. And we had them go through, read the races, and so each pair would have a different race, and they would have to give a little presentation about it. And oh my gosh, I learned so much about gnomes. And actually, it's funny. So I had girls that had played with me before, and they knew sort of like the big 5 or the big 3 races, right? Like they knew halflings and humans and elves. And dwarves, but they didn't know some of the other races. And for them to do that research really it brought those races to life, and it made them want to play them. And it's not just the showy races either, not just like tieflings, but like they were we had 2 girls who they decided they were going to be like bards and they were going to be gnomes, and it was solely on the back of that. So that worked out well. And I want to circle back to the tutorial dungeon very briefly, because I think this is, Sandboxing versus railroad, I'm going to use those two terms because they're commonly used in dungeon mastering and role-playing games. And railroading gets a really bad rap because railroading, the concept between railroading and sandboxing, just to recap, is railroading is that you have your players stuck on rails. It's no fun. Oh my gosh, there's only one way we can go. Boring. I want to play in the sandbox. Right? Everybody wants to be in a sandbox where you can do anything, man. I can build like a sandcastle, or I can build a spaceship, or whatever. And the problem is that you can do anything, and so you end up either doing nothing, or you end up burning down the library. And especially with new players, I think it is so important. So I would say two things. Like we've talked about starting fast, and we've talked about kind of being on rails. And I think that's a totally legitimate and important thing to consider when you're starting off, especially with new, younger players. Start fast, keep it on rails, get that tutorial going. And that tutorial, like for me, you guys have a tutorial dungeon I think you've been very intentional about. My tutorial, it was like, to hear them describe their tutorial dungeon, it was almost identical to the first crypt that I ran my students through. And that was sort of like my gut instinct, like we need to go through all this stuff. And I think that you kind of converge on this strategy, right? Which is, and I love that concept, tutorial dungeon. I do want to just mention, by the way, that we did also roll ability scores. But we didn't.
That's so brave. You're such a brave dungeon master.
I was so mean. I made them roll 3d6 in order, which is old school D&D style. So we had like some 6s and stuff. And it was awesome. They were like, man, my character is so weak. And so their character would be like crawling around sometimes. But they loved it. It's great to have those extremes, especially with kids. They love having that kind of like extreme, personality to latch onto. So I had my students, peril comes to town. They are forced out of their town by these like strange beings called wolf riders. They haven't seen them. They just hear them. They're terrifying. I hope you're all feeling a little nervous just from the word wolf rider.
I feel nervous from wolf riders.
Yeah, and so they're kind of being pursued through the forest, and they're really like getting some, they're anxious. And the first issue with my girls was that they had a battle with some kobolds. They run across these kobolds that have kidnapped a girl. They've kidnapped a little girl. And initially I'm like, I'm playing it pretty old school. I'm like, okay, we're gonna have some kobolds, and we need some sort of bad guy. I want them to be obviously evil. They're kidnappers. Who likes kidnappers, right? And so there's a battle, and they're fighting with these kobolds. And partway through, I'm like, I'm rethinking my strategy. Like, I just put them in a situation where now they have to murder humanoids. Maybe I don't want them to murder right away. They're going home tonight. What did you do today, honey? We killed some people. Right? You just, of course, unfortunately, this is in the middle of battle. So what I did was, we call that a teachable moment. Maybe for me as much as for them.
Yeah.
And so they're fighting, and they've got these kobolds, and there's one girl at my table. In fact, she was the girl on the previous slide with the player's handbook that was very nicely organized. And she's a finisher. This girl she finishes homework, she finishes everything, and she plans ahead. And she decided that she needed to, when we were close to the end of the battle, she's like, we are going to kill these kobolds. And first, I had them subdue the kobolds, and we introduced this idea. So we're introducing the idea, you can fight to subdue them, you can fight to knock them out. Great. They do that. They tie them up. And she's like, now we're killing them. Because you got to tie off this loose end, right?
Can't have them coming back.
Right. And part of me is like, way to think ahead. I get where you're coming from. And I talked to her about this, right? I'm like, I get this. I get what you're thinking right now as a player. But now we're going to talk about alignment. And we'll talk more about this in modifying the game, but one of my rules is no evil characters. We'll talk about why, but I had them pick like an alignment at that point. I was like, lawful, neutral, evil. We're just going to start off with that. And what does that mean? Now we'll talk about good and evil. What would your neutral, good character that you just created, what would they do in this situation? Would they cruelly, and I'll admit, I'm trying to sway the jury a little bit, would they cruelly just kill these kobolds that you've tied up, or would they just let them be tied up for now? You think about it. and I give them the teacher eye. Think about it.
The powerful teacher.
Very powerful.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and of course they left them. Now, they leave them and they have to like examine these runes, and while they're examining the runes, unfortunately the wolves show up and kill the kobolds. But the players didn't do it.
Yeah.
So
Decision made.
yeah. So the idea being here that I did end up running them through a what did you call it again? A tutorial dungeon.
Yeah, yeah.
But I also, along the way, we're all doing this, we're introducing aspects of the game. And so we call this scaffolding in the teaching biz. And we scaffold up like that.
There's a couple of other tricks before we get to modifying the game that we have found really useful with new kids. So a lot of times choices can be overwhelming, especially because there's a character sheet that gives you a lot of options, but also it's a story game where you can do anything. So if you have a player who's sort of freezing, you can oftentimes what we do, hand them a spoon or hand them a fork. And if handing them a spoon is sort of like spoon feeding them, where you're like, so you're at the doorway. Do you want to open it? And they're like, yeah, I want to open it. Great, because that's what was the next thing in the sort of semi-linear
That's a
dungeon.
spoon.
That's a spoon. That's like, I'm spoon feeding this to you. So you guys want to sneak in? The answer
Yes.
is almost always yes. And that's a good way to just give them an option. They don't have to choose it, but it's always like a really clear option that you can give them. And there's nothing wrong with that, because you want to increase the play and decrease the anxiety. And doing that is an offer. It's a question. Do you want to do that? And then it gives them a way to sort of move the story forward without worrying about making choices if the person is stressed out about making the wrong choice. Another thing that we can do sometimes is do what I call hand them a fork. And that's where you give them some options. So do you want to climb over the wall, or do you want to climb under the wall? And they're like, well, I guess my character sheet is good at says I'm good at climbing, so I'm going to climb over the wall. And you can give them options, which then once again reduces the anxiety. Or they might say, I'm going to blow up the wall. And that's a great answer too. But
That's the knife. Spoon, fork, and knife.
The idea there is just reducing the stress of making decisions. And because like we said before, that the play is the thing. And so if your players are feeling stressed out, don't worry too much about giving them an alley-oop. Let them move the story forward in a way that makes them feel successful.
We actually do this a lot in character creation. I mentioned before that we ask a series of questions to give like a very small amount of background for characters. The way we do that is that we ask them, is your character from a big city or a small town? So that's giving them a fork. And then when they answer that, we name the big city or the small town, and then we say, what is your big city or small town known for? And now we're creating an open-ended question. And this is also sort of a litmus test to see how well they can handle that. Because there are some kids who handle that just fine, and they go, we're well known for all of our colorful hats. And you go, great. Now this big city is well known for all of its colorful hats. And then there's other players who really hem and haw, really struggle being able to make a decision about that. This gives you kind of an idea of, is this a player who's going to need a lot of spoons and a lot of forks, and I need to be very purposeful about thinking about that when I give them options and I see them starting to pause. And then we ask a couple of other questions that are really great. Does your character have any siblings? Or do they have a good relationship with their parents? This is very like therapy of us, but it's also great for character backstory. You get a lot of those like really early on orphaned characters. That just happens like early D&D players always want to make their characters like tragic orphans, which I think is awesome.
I'm an adult.
It's terrible. Orphans that's
my
awful,
characters are tragic orphans.
Yeah.
That has been my entire history of making characters.
Yeah. But then we also like to ask, one of the best questions is, why did your character become an adventurer? What brought them out? You grew up in this small town in this big city, and then they left to become an adventurer. And that is leading them down the path that you know they have to get to, because eventually they have to say, I became an adventurer, not, I took on farming just like my father did before me, and now I'm a farmer. Although...
Yeah, I knew you were going to do this, right? Yeah,
you did a great thing with specifically like the farming, the background stuff that you were talking about before.
Yeah. I mean, these are two different approaches. So one of the things that I love about Dungeon Crawl Classics is you start off as nobody. You're just some person living in the world, going about your day. You might be an assistant pig keeper, if any of you have read the Book of Three. Or the Black Cauldron. So I love that arc. I love the hero's journey story, right? I love that you can come from nothing and you can become somebody in your story. And I will admit that one of the things that I don't love about 5e, Dungeons and Dragons, is that you start off as a hero. You're a hero. You are awesome. And some kids love that, and that can be super fun. But I tell you that for the Friday Night Club girls that I ran through a grueling campaign where they were level 0. So to be clear, this is how we started out. Level 0 for like 8 weeks. At the end of that 8 weeks, they leveled up. And I will just mention this because this is part of the tutorial dungeon.
Yeah.
So at the end of their crypt, they had gone into this crypt, and they had puzzles, and they had battles, and they found this demon, and they had to fight it. And at the end of this battle, they find a door in the cavern, and they go into this previously hidden door. And there's a hallway, and in the hallway are 1,000 doors. Now, my students thought I said 1,000 dwarves. So to this day, that group will talk about the Hall of 1,000 Dwarves, but I assure you it was 1,000 doors. And each character goes into a different door. And as they pass through, they change. And they become the person they're meant to be. And that is it's a powerful moment for them, and we actually give them a physical token when that happens. I gave them each a fantasy ring that I ordered from one of these fantasy coin dealers online, and it has a hole in it, and we made necklaces out of them, and every one of those girls wears it every day of her life, still. It is part of their identity as like a human. And so, I approached it very differently, I guess, because we did level 0. Yeah. But I asked them after that, I'm like, how did you feel knowing now, by the way, everybody else gets to start off at level 1 normally. Do you hate me? And they were like, you know what? We really feel like we earned level 1. We loved it. So don't shy away from that. Run starting at level 1 if you want to. You can also start off as a 0 level, and that's one of my core modifications, I would say, which will maybe lead us into talking about modifications.
It's actually a good intro.
I am nailing these segues, by the way.
You're so good on. You're right on top of it. So you should definitely feel free to modify the game. In general, Adam and I say, especially with games like 5th edition where it's got a lot of rules and it's got a ton of stuff going on, modify it like crazy. Change it to be the game that you need it to be. Use the rules that are important to you and that are helpful to you, and discard the ones that are not, or change them. You should absolutely feel free. Role-playing games are all about telling stories, and so if the rules are getting in the way of your telling stories, get rid of those rules. Ultimately, that's a big part of it. But we'll give you a lot of tips on good ways to modify the game as you're learning and playing with kids.
As Ethan said, we don't have evil characters in our games. That's sort of one of our table rules, and I would say my background is in education, much like Ethan, so we bring a lot of teacher tricks to the table. So we do like routinize the beginning sort of table rules, where we talk about what are the expectations for behavior and also for the game, and then I say that every character is a hero, and that may be against what Ethan was saying earlier, but
I mean, they eventually become heroes.
We literally say you are a hero, and then we have a discussion about what that means. Oftentimes that just means you're brave. Oftentimes it means you take risks. So it doesn't always mean you reduce suffering or anything like that. Or the only exception that I have to allowing an evil character was a guy who made a necromancer. And that was the journey that they needed to go on, was having a necromancer. And so I said, the only condition that I'm going to let you be evil is if it's a journey of redemption. And that was the only time I've ever had an evil character. Other than that, I say you have to be a hero, and we can discuss the specifics of what a hero means.
How did that work out?
You're a good guy. How did it work for the necromancer? It was perfect because this was a player. So once again, we're doing therapeutic work, social skill building, but also dealing with anxiety and depression and things like that. And so if you think about what a necromancer is a person who has control, and they can control their friends. So their friends are people who they can predict, and control and dismiss when they're tired of them. So it was a perfect analog for the kinds of things that this person was doing in their real life, was unable to deal with friendships that they couldn't control. So then I sort of phased in real partnership and real camaraderie with the team while phasing out the importance of the friends that they could control.
That's awesome.
Yeah, that was a great move.
So anyway, we often have people who come in wanting to kill the kobolds, like you said. Like there's a lot of like, well, I want to cut his head off. I want to torture him. I want to get information out of him. A lot of those things. And I think in general, and Ethan, you can speak to this a little bit too, but like I think kids have a pretty good understanding about what's real and what's not real for the most part. And so I think there's a way to play with some of that stuff that's not necessarily problematic.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. So this is the kobold murder problem. It's my thumbnail for it, right?
Yeah.
And I want to bring up 2 points. One is I specifically play with middle school girls, and I never want to pull my punches with them, and I really work hard at not pulling my punches with them. If they want to be bloodthirsty murderers, I want to enable that. Now, that being said,
Asterisk.
Asterisk. I think that, and again, reality testing in kids is pretty good, right? They know when something is make-believe and when it's not. You go back and you read Grimm's fairy tales and they're like horrific, but kids can read fairy tales, they can play video games, they can play role-playing games, they can engage in violence in those environments and know that it is not real violence and that it does not translate to violent behavior in the real world. I think you guys should talk more about this specifically, because I don't want to go out of my depth here, and there's a limit past which I won't go. But I do want them to think, first of all, I don't want them to just assume that this is a game of violence. It's a game of creative problem solving. It's a game of teamwork, right? It's a game of finding the puzzle. It's a game of routing around the problem, routing around the monster as much as fighting the monster. It's a game of exploration. So I want them to get into battle, and I want them to fight, and I want them to be fierce, and I also want them to be creative, and I want them to be explorers. And I think that the key to, and 5e does a good job with this, calling it the 3 pillars, right? Combat, exploration, and social interaction. And I think that if you're hitting those 3 pillars in whatever game you're doing, that you're going to succeed with kids.
So I think the biggest at least we could talk about the violence thing.
Yeah.
That's maybe worthwhile to talk about. There are concerns as far as what is appropriate for kids, what is appropriate levels of violence, or where is that a thing I should be concerned about as a parent, as a teacher, as somebody who's playing games with young kids. And what I'll tell you is that there is not a lot of evidence that violence within games actually has any kind of translation into violence in real life. But you still want to be concerned. We have a rating system for movies for a reason. I still want to be concerned about what kind of exposure I want to have, I want to give to the kids in our groups for violence at different levels and at different ages. It's worthwhile to have a level of concern for those things. And the great thing about role-playing games, especially as the Dungeon Master, is you can control that. A lot of the games that we play with our youngest kids, they fight mostly against skeletons and constructs before they start fighting against humans and orcs. It's a great introduction. There's going to be violent stuff, but you're fighting against robots. It's like, did anybody ever watch the old Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles cartoon show? Everything they fought was always robots. They never, because they had swords. And how horrific would that have been if they were cutting people up with swords? And so you can do that. You can change the world so that the main bad guy that you're fighting is something that's not gruesome or not horrific. If you have a feeling or a sense that maybe that's not an appropriate exposure that the kids at this table need to have right at this moment. So you should feel free to be able to make those adjustments, but you should also know that kids do have a really good sense for being able to tell when it's imagination and when it's not. And you can do quite a lot to be able to set up that expectation. You can say things like, your character does this. That is making it clear. It's not you doing this thing. It is your character doing this thing. You can set up a start and an end, which we always highly encourage. Have a routine. When you're going to start playing, have a routine that starts it. Maybe everybody asks, our players ask check-in questions, answer a check-in question at the start of the game. That's a great way to start the routine of, now we're going to play the game. And at the end of the game, we have them ask check-out questions of spotlights they'd like to give for other people, things they thought was challenging in the game, things they predict for next time. And it gives a great container to this space. We know that this is the play space where we're playing with these characters. And when we leave here, we're not those characters anymore. And it helps to give clear boundaries and clear expectations for how much of this is play and how much of it is not play. But in general, kids are pretty good at being able to tell the difference.
There's also some tricks you can do in combat where just the language you choose to use can highlight or lowlight the actual violence of the encounter. So I'll sometimes, especially with my more bloodthirsty players, I'll say stuff like, well, you defeated them, or they're down for the count. And I'll use sort of the language of they're knocked out. I cut off his head, right? And then I will selectively ignore some of those questions too. It's another good teacher trick. Just ignore the stuff you don't want to answer and then highlight the stuff that you do. So there are oftentimes, that's a trick that I'll do with combat specifically, and if they're fighting constructs, I'll say you destroyed it or things like that. But if they're fighting a humanoid, especially if they get goblins, which are great low-level combat, those goblins aren't going to be slaughtered because then they're going to go home and tell their parents, we took no mercy on those goblins today.
Yeah, and going back to that first adventure that I ran for my Friday Night Club girls, they after the whole debacle with the kobolds, henceforth known as the Kobold debacle.
Yeah, sure.
I decided to lean really heavily on insects, and so they would always fight like giant centipedes and stuff like that, right? Ankh eggs, and that's cool. And then it's fine, but I had this thematic thing going with these wolf riders, and so I'm like, man, I got to circle back to this like whole wolf theme. So I decided that wolves are kind of scary, and they're not people, and they're not humanoid. I'm gonna have some wolves. I grew up in rural Wisconsin, right? So the concept of wolves is scary, right? And I thought, what a great, neutral monster. But of course, then I was like, oh my God, they're dogs, right? But so at some point, like these wolves come out, and I was kind of presenting them as these like fierce creatures, and I'd kind of painted myself a little bit into a corner there, and I didn't know what I was going to do. But your players are gonna solve these problems for you sometimes, right? So one of my girls is, I have these wolves, and they're hunting the horses. I'm like, okay, I'm gonna trump the fact that they're dogs by horses are cute and charming, and we love our horses, right? So you have to protect them. And this girl goes out, and she gets attacked by one of the wolves. And that's another thing that I do is I will say, like, this wolf just bit you. And you can, you have a wound on your arm, and it's like you can feel the fangs sink into your arm, and they're like, whoa, ooh, cool, And it's that shivery kind of like, it's horrific, but they kind of want to hear it. And it also kind of turns them, sometimes I like to paint the battle like that because it makes it a little bit less easy for them to just step into. But in that particular situation, the girl decided, that she was playing, and she was like, she looked at me, and I was like, this wolf just attacked you. What are you gonna do about it? And she's like, I'm gonna, and I could tell she was like thinking about her weapon list, and she's like, wait, can I tame the wolf? And this is where you have to modify the game. Now, D&D, I was in the world building panel, or I was watching the world building session this morning, and Strix was talking about, there's two basic kinds of engines. There's physics simulation and narrative simulation. And D&D is very much a physics simulation, right? It could be the physics of magic or it's the physics of battle, but it's physics. And this is where you modify the game to be a narrative simulation. And what I did was I took the death save mechanic, which is where you have to roll 3 successes before you roll 3 failures. And so I'm like, okay, you want to tame this wolf. This is hard. This is a wild animal. You need to roll 3 successful rolls. I can't remember even what I called it, but it was something related to animal handling, probably. And it didn't matter what it was, but she had to do it 3, and it was 2 successes and 2 failures. And it came down to the last roll. And I am like letting her roll. And I am now at this point, again, I'm like, I have painted myself into every corner of this room. And what if she fails? How is she going to feel? And she succeeded. And oh my God, thank God, right? But I encourage you with kids to find the opportunity, especially if you're playing D&D, to turn the physics simulation into a narrative simulation. And I think that's a lot of what you guys do. I don't know, I feel like that's a lot of what you guys do.
We do a lot of saying yes when kids want to do stuff. It's not about what the rules say, it's about what would be, this is oftentimes referred to as the rule of cool. Rule of cool is oftentimes used in a combat scenario, but it's also rule of cool no matter what. I had players who needed to make a deal with a Dracolich. And this was a story where the Dracolich, it's a long, complicated backstory, but the Dracolich was the only thing who could possibly help them in their quest to defeat the onslaught of plants that were taking over the entire material plane. And this Dracolich was going to be like the bad guy who, like, they were going to have to make the proverbial deal with the devil to figure this out. And one of the players came up to the Dracolich and they were asking him, like, help us defeat all the plants. And the Dracolich said, why would I help you? I'm the last of my kind. I have no friends, no family, and what do I care about this world? And I thought they might have to make a deal with him, convince him, get revenge on the rest of the dragons or something. And then one of my players said, wow, that's really hard. That sounds kind of like me. I don't have a lot of friends either, and I feel alone sometimes too. And then that Dracolich was no longer the bad guy. That Dracolich was a friend. And that Dracolich was like, I didn't know anybody else felt like me. And then they formed a bond, the player and the Dracolich, that then ended up at the end of the story, the Dracolich, like, the deal with the devil was making new Dracoliches. And then the player was like the sort of new mother to all the baby Dracoliches. And that was a lot of just saying yes, because I have no idea what the rules of raising baby Dracoliches are.
So basically, Sigourney Weaver becomes friends with the alien.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Okay.
I want to be conscious of time, and I wanted to make sure we have a mic right in the center of the room, and we wanted to do some Q&A in case anybody has any questions for us or about playing games with kids or anything like that. So if anybody does have any questions, you can head to the mic, and we'd be happy to answer as many as we can with the time we have left. We also have a couple of last little plugs, so while you guys are lining up.
So one thing, so the next slide is actually a video. So the one other thing we wanted to offer as a takeaway is that, like many things for kids, D&D is very similar. Moving beats sitting, speaking beats listening. There's lots of ways you can modify the game to make the game more engaging. So one thing that we do a certain amount is having kids embody their characters, physically stand up from the table and act out how they're swinging their weapon. And so I have a video here of some of Ethan's students doing that very thing.
I love the slow-mo.
Yeah, the slow-mo. This goes on all the time. And in fact, the previous slide was also embodiment because it was a girl with her eyes covered up and she was blindfolded and she had to navigate through the room.
Perfect.
In a simulation. So, okay.
So all that's great tools. There's nothing in D&D that says get up from the table and jump around or put on a blindfold if your character has been blinded, but that's a way to make the game engaging for players.
Yeah.
Let's start
let's do some questions.
Sure. Yeah, you'd mentioned check in and check out with gaming. I'm unfamiliar with that. Do you have an example or a reason?
Yeah, so in our groups we do a check-in. We pass around a totem object. We actually have a big D6 that we like to pass around. The check-in questions are always more questions for players to continue to build good interaction with each other, but it also gives us a sort of litmus test to see how much players are identifying with their characters. So we'll ask questions, even simple questions like, what's your favorite ice cream? And then, what is your character's favorite ice cream? And this gives a great opportunity to both think about and deepen your character's backstory, but also to think about your relationship with your character. Is it the same or is it different? Is it drastically different? Those are all kind of really good questions to ask. We'll sometimes get into deeper questions as well, like what advice would your character give you, or what advice would you give your character? Which can be great sort of steps as you get deeper and deeper into it to think about how your character and yourself relate to each other.
And then for our checkout, at the end of every session, we pass around the same D6. And we ask 3 questions. One is, what's a spotlight on somebody else? So then it's an opportunity to give a compliment to somebody else and to think about what somebody else did that was cool, because a lot of people who play D&D are used to playing video games where they're like, I want to get the awesome thing to have happen, and I want everybody to see me do that thing, get the highest damage rolls or whatever it is. So a spotlight is an opportunity to say, what is something somebody else did that enhanced the game? The second one is, what is something that was challenging or something you learned? And that's an opportunity for you to learn about sort of what their challenge point is, but also to have them frame something that was challenging as a success. What's something you pushed through? Which is great. Or you learned how to climb walls. That's great too. Just a framework on success and growth. And the third question is, what is something you're predicting or looking forward to for the next time you play? And that's oftentimes good for the players to sort of get ready for the next game, but also you as a dungeon master, you know what they're excited about. They say, I really think that barkeeper really is the demon. You're like, okay, I'm going to write that down. Maybe they are. Or they really like a particular NPC or something like that. So it's good to sort of chum for what's going to build engagement.
How do you mitigate fallout between the players, like betrayal? I actually ran a game for some 4th graders, and I had a rule where the players could pick each other back up if one of them fell down during a fight, and when one of the boys fell down, the girls went and picked him up, but when one of the girls fell down, the boys ran. There was much fallout.
Yeah.
Do you have any
I can talk really briefly about this. We had a couple of situations. I mean, they're kids, and there will be conflict. Our big issue was not in-game. It was more meta issues, like talking over each other, not listening, and things like that. And it really got out of hand one particular session. And I actually stopped the session early, and we talked about it briefly. And this is kind of like democratic classroom stuff, where we established norms early on, and we kind of we tweaked our norms, and we talked about like what would norms be that we could put in place that would make sure everybody is heard in what rules. And so we instituted a rule at that point, which was we can talk over each other for it to be fun and exciting, but if somebody raises their hand, everybody stops and listens to that person. So that was a specific example, and the general case would be that we pause, reevaluate our norms, and figure out what went wrong there. But do you want to talk briefly?
I think we're actually out of time.
I have a super quick answer. I have a mechanic at the table where I say you can't do anything against another player unless the group votes on it and says it's okay. So like stealing something from another player or something like that, which may be seen as antisocial, but it also might be something that increases the bond in the group, because now we have a funny story. So then I want to steal something from this player, but the game master has to say, is that okay that he steals that thing from you? Because we're building a story together, and I don't want anything as the game master to cause real life conflict between my players, because my ultimate goal is for it to be fun and to build relationships. So I don't want anything. I just say no. You can't do that. Is that okay with you that you get stabbed or stolen from or whatever?
Follow us on Twitter. Ask us this stuff. I have so many thoughts about this too.
Yeah, actually, if you do have any remaining questions, unfortunately we won't be able to get to them, but we will be right outside right after the panel, and you should definitely come in and track us down.
Talk.
Definitely contact us on Twitter. Feel free to hit up Game to Grow, or Ethan is like the most prolific tweeter I think I've ever met, so he will respond to anything that you
If
send
you're
him.
staying through the rest of PAX too, we also have a table outside of Uncle's Games, and we'll be there most of the weekend, so come say hi.
Shameless plug. I love it.
Yeah. Thank you guys so much. Enjoy the rest of your PAX.